It is the autumn of 1944, and the Second World War has entered one of its bloodiest chapters. The Allies have stormed the beaches of Normandy, fought their way across France, and now Patton's Third Army is bearing down on the German border. The roads are lined with ruined villages, shattered trees, and the broken remains of tanks and artillery. Mud, rain, and exhaustion cling to every soldier. But for one unit, the battle is being fought on two fronts, against Hitler's armies abroad, and against racism within their own ranks. This was the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers. They were the first African-American armored unit to see combat in Ypres. History. Their motto, "Come out fighting," was not just bravado, but necessity. In an era when the army itself was segregated, when many believed black soldiers lacked the courage or intelligence to fight effectively, the men of the 761st carried a burden no white soldier bore. Every skirmish was not only against the Germans, but against prejudice itself. Among them was a 5-year-old staff sergeant named Ruben Rivers, born in Oklahoma to parents of both black and Cherokee heritage. Rivers had grown up in the hard-scrabble realities of rural farm life. He was no stranger to toil, no stranger to hardship. His men remembered him as disciplined, fearless, and fiercely protective of those under his command. When he volunteered for service, he carried with him the quiet determination to prove, once and for all, that courage knew no color. By November 1944, the 761st had already endured weeks of combat. Their tanks rolled through mud-choked fields and small French towns, spearheading Patton's advance. And it was here, near the town of Morville, Les Vic, that Rivers' legend truly began. On November 8th, German machine gun nests stopped the American advance cold. The road was blocked, mined, and under a withering hail of fire. Most men would have waited for engineers or artillery support. Rivers chose another path. He leapt from his Sherman tank, exposed himself to enemy fire, attached a cable to the German obstacle, and dragged it out of the way with his tank. What seemed like madness in the moment became salvation for his unit, clearing the road so they could continue the fight. That reckless act of bravery earned him the battalion's first Silver Star. But it was only the beginning. 8 days later, on November 16, his luck turned. Rivers' lead tank struck a teller mine near the village of Gwebling. The explosion was catastrophic, shredding his right leg to the bone with shrapnel. Medics rushed forward, offering morphine and evacuation. His commander, Captain David Williams, insisted he leave the battlefield, but Rivers shook his head. He refused the morphine. He refused to be carried away. He knew that if he left, his platoon would falter, and he would not abandon them. With blood soaking his uniform and agony racking his body, Rivers climbed into another tank and resumed command. For 3 more days he fought on, driving his platoon forward, directing fire, and refusing to show weakness. His men later admitted they could barely believe what they were seeing. Rivers seemed to operate on pure willpower, as if pain were irrelevant. To them, he was no longer just a leader. He was a living symbol of defiance, of strength, of the idea that nothing, not even a crippling wound, could force them to retreat. The climax came on November 19. At dawn, the 761st attempted to advance once again. Suddenly, German anti-tank guns opened up, devastating the American line. Shells tore through Shermans like paper. It was a hopeless position. Captain Williams, recognizing the slaughter, gave the order to pull back. But then came a voice over the radio Rivers's. His words were short, sharp, and resolute. "I see 'em. We'll fight 'em." Everyone knew what that meant. To charge entrenched anti-tank guns in a Sherman was suicide. But Rivers wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about his men. If the Germans kept firing, the entire company could be annihilated. So Rivers made his choice. He led his tank, along with one other, directly into the storm. The Germans turned their guns on him immediately. Shells whistled through the air, slamming into the mud around him. Still, Rivers advanced. His Sherman opened fire, blasting at the enemy positions, drawing the fury of the defenders. In those desperate moments, he became the shield behind which his comrades escaped. But heroism comes at a cost. A direct hit struck Rivers' tank, killing him instantly and wounding the rest of his crew. His sacrifice had not been in vain. His company survived, thanks to his final, defiant charge. Captain Williams wasted no time. He submitted Rivers for the Medal of Honor, yet the paperwork vanished. Officially, he was lost. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. No African American received the Medal of Honor during World War II. The highest recognition Rivers received was silence. For decades, the story of Ruben Rivers was nearly forgotten. His comrades remembered him, but the nation did not. It wasn't until the 1992nd, when the Army conducted a review into racial discrimination in the awarding of medals, that Rivers' name resurfaced. Historians concluded that prejudice, not merit, had dictated the denials. Finally, in 1997, more than 50 years after his death, President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers. Rivers' legacy, however, goes beyond the medal. His sacrifice, and that of the 761st, helped prove beyond doubt that black soldiers were every bit as courageous and capable as their white counterparts. The performance of the 761st and similar segregated units laid the groundwork for President Truman's 1948 decision to desegregate the U.S. Armed Forces. In that sense, Rivers' final act did more than save his company. It struck a blow against the very prejudice he had carried into battle. In remembering him, we see more than just a tale of battlefield valor. We see the story of a man who refused to yield to his wounds, to his enemies, or to the injustice of his own nation. A man who became unbreakable, even as the world tried to break him. Imagine being 19 years old in 1941, a college student in Washington State. You are American-born. You pledge allegiance to the flag. You dream of a future like any other young man. But after December 6th, Pearl Harbor changes everything, suddenly, because of your Japanese ancestry. You and your family are stripped of your rights, herded into camps surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by men with rifles. The country you love now treats you as the enemy. This was the world James Okubo lived in, born to Japanese immigrant parents. Okubo and his family were among the more than 110,000 Japanese Americans forced into internment camps after Pearl Harbor. The humiliation and injustice would have been enough to embitter anyone. Yet Okubo chose a different path. When the U.S. Army created the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an all-volunteer unit composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans, he stepped forward. While his family remained behind fences, he went to war to prove his loyalty. The 442nd's motto was short and fierce. Go for broke. They would become one of the most decorated units of World War II, earning over 18,000 awards in just 2 years of combat. But the decorations came at an appalling price. Casualties so heavy the unit became synonymous with sacrifice. Among their ranks, James Okubo served as a medic, unarmed, yet constantly exposed, charged with saving lives rather than taking them. The moment that cemented his legend came in the dark forests of the Vosges Mountains in late October 1944. The mission was desperate. Rescue the lost battalion. A Texan battalion had advanced too far and become surrounded by German forces. Repeated attempts to break through had failed. The men of the 442nd were ordered to do the impossible, cut their way through heavily fortified positions, and save their fellow Americans. The Vosges was a nightmare. Cold rain soaked the soldiers, mud sucked at their boots, and artillery shattered treetops into deadly wooden shrapnel. Every step forward meant casualties, and it was in this hellscape that James Okubo displayed a courage that defies imagination. On October 28, his unit was pinned down under relentless enemy fire. Wounded soldiers lay scattered across the forest floor, out of reach. To reach them meant crawling across 150 yards of open ground, through machine gun fire and grenade blasts. Any rational man would have stayed in cover. Okubo didn't hesitate. He crawled forward again and again, dragging men back, patching wounds, applying morphine, and carrying the injured on his own shoulders. That day alone, he treated and evacuated 17 soldiers. The following day, he did it again, saving another 8. Grenades exploded around him. Bullets cracked through the air. But he moved with single-minded determination, as though death itself had no claim on him. To the men of his unit, it was as if he had become untouchable, an angel of mercy crawling through mud and fire. But his most extraordinary act was still to come. On November 4, an American tank was hit and engulfed in flames. Ammunition inside began to cook off, turning the vehicle into a furnace, ready to explode. The crew was trapped. No one dared approach. It was suicide. But Okubo ran. He sprinted across 75 yards of open ground, machine guns tracking him every step. He clambered onto the burning tank, pulled the wounded crewman out, and dragged him to safety. It was an act so daring, so reckless, that it left even hardened combat veterans speechless. For this, Okubo's commander immediately recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Yet bureaucracy and prejudice intervened. His recommendation was downgraded to a Silver Star, under the mistaken belief that medics could not be awarded higher honors. In truth, many suspected that his Japanese ancestry played no small role, and so, one of the greatest acts of selfless courage in the European theater went largely unrecognized. After the war, Okubo returned to civilian life. He became a dentist in Detroit, married, and raised a family. 2 neighbors. He was quiet, humble, kind. Few knew the depths of his wartime service. He rarely spoke about it, carrying the memories silently. In 1967, he died tragically in a car accident, long before his story was told to the wider world. But time has a way of forcing nations to confront their failures. In the 1,990 seconds, Congress launched a review of the records of Asian American and Pacific Islander veterans of World War II. The investigation was damning. It revealed that many had been denied the Medal of Honor not because they lacked valor, but because of racial prejudice. Among the cases re-examined was James Okubo's. His Silver Star, they concluded, was never enough. And so, on June 20, President Bill Clinton stood in the East Room of the White House and presented the Medal of Honor to 22 Asian American heroes, many posthumously. James Okubo was one of them. His brothers in arms accepted the medal on his behalf, finally giving voice to the courage that had gone unheard for half a century. Okubo's story is not only about personal bravery, it is about the contradictions of America in wartime. He fought for a nation that imprisoned his family. He risked his life to save others while being denied the recognition he deserved. And yet, in his actions, he embodied the highest ideals of service, compassion, and sacrifice. In the mud of the Vosges, he proved that heroism is not defined by the weapon in your hand, but by the lengths you are willing to go for another human being. James Okubo was a medic, but in those forests, he was also a warrior. Not against enemies, but against death itself. The summer of 1944 had turned the tide of war. D-Day was behind them. Allied armies were streaming across France, and German forces were falling back in disarray. Yet even in retreat, the Wehrmacht was dangerous. Near the town of Chambois in August, the Allies closed in on a vast pocket of German troops, the infamous Falaise Pocket. Here, tens of thousands of German soldiers, tanks, and vehicles were trapped, desperate to escape through a narrow corridor. If the Allies sealed it, the German 7th Army would be crushed. If they failed, the enemy might regroup and fight again. In the middle of this decisive battle stood a 20-year-old sergeant named John Bud Hawk, only 2 weeks out of high school when he joined the army. Hawk was still young enough to be mistaken for a boy. Yet in combat, he showed the instincts of a veteran. By August, he commanded a machine gun squad, tasked with holding back whatever tried to break through the narrowing gap. On the morning of August 20, Hawk's unit faced the fury of the German counterattack. Waves of infantry surged forward. Supported by tanks, Hawk and his men opened fire, mowing down soldiers, forcing them back, but the tanks were relentless. An artillery shell exploded nearby. knocking out Hawk's machine gun and sending hot steel into his right thigh. Blood streamed down his leg. For many, that would have been the end. For Hawk, it was only the beginning. With his primary weapon destroyed, he grabbed a bazooka and kept firing. He would not leave his men. Then, 2 American M10 tank destroyers arrived, reinforcements at last. But the terrain worked against them. From their position, the tank destroyers could not see the advancing German armor. Their shots went wide. While the German tanks closed in with lethal precision, it was in that moment that Hawk made a choice that defies belief. He scrambled out of cover, climbed onto an exposed knoll, and stood tall in plain view of both German and American guns. Enemy fire immediately zeroed in on him. Bullets kicked up dirt at his feet. Shells screamed overhead. But he didn't flinch. Hawk realized that if the tank destroyers couldn't see their targets, he would become their eyes. What followed was an act so daring it bordered on madness. Hawk spotted the German tanks from his knoll, then sprinted back through enemy fire to the American gunners, shouting directions, physically pointing out where to aim. Then he ran back to the exposed hilltop to watch the results, correcting their fire, and repeating the process again and again. Each dash through the bullet-swept field was a gamble with death. His wounded legs slowed him, but he refused to stop. And it worked. Guided by Hawk's insane bravery, the tank destroyers began landing hits. 1 German tank erupted in flames. Another was disabled, and a third retreated under the withering fire. The German counterattack stalled, but Hawk wasn't finished. Remaining on his knoll, he continued to direct artillery and machine gun fire into the surrounding woods. The effect was devastating. German morale collapsed, and within hours, more than 500 enemy soldiers laid down their weapons and surrendered. What began as a desperate, bloody gamble ended in a stunning Allied victory, one that helped close the jaws of the Falaise pocket and cripple the German 7th Army. For his courage, Hawk was recommended for the Medal of Honor. Unlike Rivers and Okubo, his award was not delayed. Just a year later, President Harry S. Truman placed the medal around his neck personally. Hawk returned home after the war, but unlike many veterans who faded into obscurity, he built a new life as a teacher and principal. He spent decades shaping young minds in Washington State. A man who had risked everything in combat, but sought peace in the classroom. What makes Hawk's story remarkable is not only his battlefield heroism, but the humility that followed. When asked about the medal, he never spoke of personal glory. He always insisted it belonged to his comrades, especially those who never made it home. "I hold it in trust," he would say, "for those I served with, for those who gave their lives." Hawk's bravery at the Falaise pocket was a singular act, but its impact rippled far beyond that battlefield. By stopping the German breakout, he helped ensure the destruction of one of Hitler's last major armies in the West. The road to Paris, and ultimately into Germany itself, lay open, and it had been cleared in part by a young man who turned his body into a living aiming stake. History is full of generals and strategies, but sometimes a single soldier standing on a hill decides the fate of a battle. That morning in August 1944, Sergeant John Bud Hawk was that soldier. When we piece together the lives of Ruben Rivers, James Okubo, and John Bud Hawk, it is tempting to see them only as individual acts of valor, moments of fire and blood frozen in time. But their stories, when viewed side by side, tell us something larger about World War II and about the United States itself. They are windows into the contradictions of a nation at war, fighting fascism abroad, while struggling with prejudice at home, demanding sacrifice from ordinary men, yet often forgetting to honor them when the guns fell silent. Staff Sergeant Rivers' sacrifice was not simply the story of one tanker holding a line. It was the story of an entire unit, the 761st Black Panthers, proving, with every advance through mud and fire, that the color of one's skin did not determine courage. Their determination was mirrored by other segregated units, like the Tuskegee Airmen, who challenged stereotypes in the skies over Europe, and the 92nd Infantry Division, which fought bitter battles in Italy. Together, these soldiers dismantled the poisonous myth that valor belonged only to some races. The fact that Rivers' Medal of Honor was delayed for more than half a century reveals not just oversight, but institutional prejudice. And yet, in the long view of history, his courage contributed to a reckoning that pushed America toward Truman's 1948 order to desegregate the armed forces, a decision that reshaped the military forever. James Okubo's story exposes another painful contradiction. While his family lived behind barbed wire in internment camps, he went into battle to rescue fellow Americans in the Vosges Mountains. The Lost Battalion episode is often remembered as one of the most dramatic rescues of the war. But what lingers is the bitter irony. Men like Okubo risked everything to prove loyalty to a nation that had doubted them. His story echoes that of the entire 442nd Regimental Combat Team, whose record of decorations remains unmatched for its size and length of service. Their battle cry, "Go for broke," was not just a motto, but a declaration of dignity in the face of prejudice. In the decades since, the delayed recognition of Okubo and his comrades has become a symbol of how nations must confront uncomfortable truths about injustice, even long after the war has ended. And then there is Bud Hawk. His courage at the Falaise Pocket was not overshadowed by race or heritage. His Medal of Honor was awarded swiftly. But his story, too, carries lessons. Hawk reminds us that heroism is not always about commanding armies or shaping strategy. It is about the impossible decisions made by young men in moments of chaos. Standing exposed on that knoll, he turned his body into a target so others could aim true. His act helped close the Falaise Pocket, a pivotal moment that crippled the German 7th Army and sped the liberation of France. Hawk's later life as a teacher and principal underscores a truth we sometimes forget. Many of the heroes who carried the weight of battle chose to spend their post-war lives building rather than destroying, teaching rather than fighting. But perhaps the most profound significance of these stories lies in what they reveal about memory. For decades, men like Rivers and Okubo were denied the honors they deserved, their names excluded from the roll call of American valor. Only in the 1,990 did congressional reviews uncover the systematic biases that had withheld recognition from minority veterans. The eventual correction, posthumous Medals of Honor, awarded by President Bill Clinton, was both a triumph and a tragedy. Triumph, because justice was finally done. Tragedy, because it came too late for the men themselves to hold the medals in their own hands. Their stories also invite us to widen our gaze. Rivers, Okubo, and Hawk were not alone. Across the war, Native American code talkers transmitted vital messages in unbreakable languages. Filipino guerrillas fought a brutal resistance campaign in the Pacific. Women of the French and Polish resistance risked torture and execution to carry intelligence across enemy lines. These groups, too, were often sidelined in official histories. By comparing them, we see a broader pattern. The most extraordinary courage often comes from those history is least prepared to celebrate. The long-term consequences of acknowledging these stories go beyond medals or ceremonies. They remind us that the narrative of World War II is not only about generals, invasions, and treaties. It is about individuals tested in moments when fear and duty collided. By revisiting the lives of Rivers, Okubo, and Hawk, we learn that true heroism lies not in fame or recognition, but in sacrifice for others. In their actions, we find lessons that stretch far beyond the war itself. Rivers teaches us that courage can stand unbroken, even in the face of prejudice. Okubo shows us that loyalty and compassion can shine brightest in times of injustice. Hawk demonstrates that one person's resolve can alter the course of an entire battle. Together, they embody the idea that heroism is not about who you are before the war begins. It is about who you choose to be in the moment when everything is on the line. History is often written in broad strokes, grand invasions, sweeping victories, and the names of generals etched into monuments. But when we step closer, when we look past the headlines and the parades, we find something even more powerful: the quiet, unshakable courage of ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things. Ruben Rivers, James Okubo, and Bud Hawk. 3 men, 3 different stories, 3 very different backgrounds. Rivers, a black tanker who fought not just German guns but the racism of his own army. Okubo, a Japanese-American medic who raced into fire to save lives while his own family was imprisoned by the government he served. Hawk, a young sergeant fresh out of high school who turned his body into a beacon for tank destroyers. holding off a German army with nothing but courage and determination. On the surface, their stories could not be more different. One died in a burning Sherman tank in France. Another crawled through mud and bullets to rescue comrades in the Vosges. The third stood alone on a knoll in Normandy, drawing fire so his men could survive. Yet at their core, they share the same heartbeat, a willingness to give everything, even life itself, for the man beside them. For decades, the stories of Rivers and Okubo were buried not by time, but by prejudice and bureaucracy. No African American received the Medal of Honor during the war. No Japanese American medic was deemed eligible. It took half a century for their names to be spoken in the White House, for their families to finally hold the medals they had earned in blood. And though Bud Hawk received his medal swiftly, even he insisted that it was not his alone, that it belonged to all those who never came home. Why do these stories matter now? Because they remind us that real heroism is not about rank or recognition. It is not about being remembered in textbooks or having a statue in a city square. Heroism lives in the choices made in the split second when fear is strongest. It lives in the soldier who runs forward when everyone else takes cover. It lives in the medic who risks his own life for another's heartbeat. It lives in the tank commander who refuses to retreat, even when he knows the end is certain. Remembering Rivers, Okubo, and Hawk is more than setting the historical record straight. It is a way of saying that courage knows no race, no heritage, no social boundary. It belongs to anyone who, when tested, puts others before themselves. Their names deserve to be known. Their sacrifices deserve to be honored. And their lessons deserve to be carried forward. As we look back on the vast canvas of World War II, let us not only celebrate the victories of nations and the strategies of leaders, but also lift up the forgotten voices, the ones who stood, fought, and fell in silence. For it is often those voices, buried beneath the roar of history, that teach us the most about what it truly means to be human. So the next time you think of World War II, do not stop at Patton, Eisenhower, or D-Day. Remember Rivers, remember Okubo, remember Hawk, and remember that the greatest acts of courage are sometimes the ones history almost lets slip away.